Edward Tennyson Reid was born in Greenwich, London in 1860, the son of Chief Naval Architect and Member of Parliament Edward James Reid. At the age of 20 he embarked on a law degree, but soon left to follow his artistic instincts at Frank Calderon's art school. Once he'd finished his art training, he briefly attempted a career as a portrait painter, but in order to actually make a living he tried his hand at creating humorous illustration and caricatures. And his natural facility for this type of expression led quickly to publication in various British magazines. In 1889 he created his first illustration for Punch magazine, and in 1893 he had his first major popular success with his pen and ink cartoon series titled Prehistoric Peeps. All of these comical scenes were depictions of Stone Age life, along with the anachronistic appearance of dinosaurs. And the illustrations were used as a comedic mirror to reflect contemporary Victorian behaviour and values. Their popularity led to them being published later in book form, and Reid traded on that success with others, such as 1898's Tales with a Twist. This was written by Lord Alfred Douglas using the alias of Belgian Hare for some reason, and the text was greatly enhanced by Reid's series of two-colour comic drawings. This was followed a year later by 1899's Book of Arms, which featured comedic parodies of heraldic coats of arms, satirising various elements of Victorian society. Although on the payroll at Punch, he was free to work for others, and his cheerful cartoons appeared in several popular magazines, including The Sketch. Unusually for the time, he frequently incorporated the subtle use of pencil shading to round out his characters rather than ink hatching, which added to the distinctive quality of his images. Reid's humour was essentially good-natured, but that didn't stop him from commenting on more serious issues. In 1906 he illustrated the book of comic verse by Mostyn Pigott titled The Beauties of Home Rule, which satirised Ireland's less than happy relations with England. And although he actually supported women's suffrage, in 1909 he created the card game Panko, or Votes for Women, which made light-hearted fun of women's bid to be able to vote. In 1912 Reid left Punch for the Bystander magazine, which became his primary source of income in the coming years, although he continued to occasionally contribute to his former employers. In 1914 he illustrated the book De Mortuis Nil Nisi Bona, which gave him ample opportunity to play to his strengths with a series of satirical depictions of many common English characteristics. And in addition to his existing book and magazine commitments, he also featured regularly in the magazine The Passing Show up to the mid-1920s, at which point all evidence of his work disappears. And E.T. Reid died in London in 1933 at the age of 73. Raphael Kirchner was born in 1876 in Vienna, Austria, and the relatively few who know about him generally consider him to be the progenitor of the modern pin-up. In his late teens he studied at the city's Academy of Fine Arts, and by 22 years old he was having work published in Ver Sacrum, the official magazine of the Vienna Secession. But it was the illustration of postcards of varying levels of erotic depictions of young women with which Kirchner built and sustained his reputation. Postcards were a significantly popular social phenomenon of this period throughout Europe, and from his first collection, published in the later 1890s, his pin-ups were immensely popular and had to be reprinted several times to meet demand. But despite his success in Austria, in 1900 Kirchner left to start again in Paris. Pursuing his life and work in the artist colony of Montmartre, his style evolved into a hybrid blend of the organic ornamentation of Art Nouveau and the more formal qualities which had defined the work of the secessionists. Before long he was not only successful with his postcards, but he was also appearing regularly in several magazines, including the sexually libertarian La Vie Parisienne. From the outset, his dominant subject for magazine work, just like his postcards, was the portrayal of female beauty, and his more explicit work was a clear indication of just how much more permissive Paris was compared with other European cities. Despite the sexualised nature of most of his images and the frequent nudity, there was no evidence of vulgarity to be found in his work, and his delicate watercolour renders played a large part in producing erotic as opposed to more pornographic pictures. Some weren't sexual at all, and his Orientalist Geisha series was among his most popular, with over 40,000 cards sold. In 1914, when war broke out in Europe, he relocated to the USA and settled in New York City, where he continued to work, even if under a more censorious regime, and also had some involvement in costume design for theatrical productions. But Raphael Kirchner died in 1917 when he was only 41. What he died from I've been unable to find out, but it must have been illness or accident, and although his span had been short, he had been a remarkably prolific and influential illustrator, inspiring many later pin-up artists to pick up where he'd left off. Miska and Maud Petersham were a pair of children's illustrators who worked effectively as a single entity, and all their work was credited accordingly. Miska was actually born in Hungary as Petreziem Mihai in 1888, and Maud Fuller in Kingston, New York in 1890. She studied art at the New York School of Fine and Applied Art, while he trained at the Royal National Art School in Budapest, before emigrating to the USA in 1912. They met while working at a commercial art studio in the city and married in 1917, at which point they set up home in Greenwich Village. In 1921, as well as some cover work for St. Nicholas magazine, they illustrated the book 24 Unusual Stories, written by Anna Cogswell Tyler. The book featured a series of cleanly executed descriptive pen and ink drawings, and it was a popular success in the USA. In 1923, Rutabaga Stories by Carl Sandburg was published, and this book enjoyed even greater popularity. Once again, the Petershams created a similar series of simple monochrome line illustrations, which added considerably to the book's appeal. In the same year, their illustrated edition of Tales from Shakespeare was published, which also featured a few stylized colour pages. And in that year they bought a plot of land and built a house in Woodstock, New York. 1926's Tales Told in Holland boasted a much larger volume of colour images, which used the same precise line work as their black and white illustration, enhanced with the simplest of flat washes of transparent colour, producing an agreeable, visually uncluttered effect. And they followed the creative and popular success of this book with a second titled Nursery Friends from France in 1927. The first book they both wrote and illustrated was Mickey, about their son, published in 1929. And from that point onward they collaborated with other writers and wrote their own illustrated books for decades to come with great success. Among their other offerings, the couple illustrated many religious stories, starting with the Ark of Father Noah and Mother Noah in 1930, and the Christ Child followed in 1931. This book appears to have been the first of their projects using tonal application of watercolour, which also looks as if it was enhanced with pencil shading. 1932's edition of Heidi by Joanna Spiri contained similar painted renders, and from this point onwards the simpler, flatter approach appears to have been abandoned. In 1933 they published the first in what would become a popular educational series on a wide range of subjects, and these books were published into the 1950s at irregular intervals. From 1938 onward they created a large volume of books featuring characters from the Old Testament, all of which were popular enough to be reprinted several times. By now the wash and pencil combination had become a stylistic trademark in their published work, and was also used for their patriotic alphabet book An American ABC, published in 1941. The Rooster Crows, subtitled The Book of American Rhymes and Jingles, was published in 1945, containing both full and selective colour images. And the Petershams continued to illustrate and write with success into the 1950s with more books, including Off to Bed in 1954. Their last appears to have been the Peppernuts in 1958, and up to this point they had illustrated more than 120 books. 2 years later, in 1960, Miska died at the age of 72, and Maud followed him in 1971, when she had reached the age of 81. German poster artist Josef Fenneker is yet another example of an illustrator who has been unjustly ignored despite his popularity in Germany during his lifetime. He was born in 1895 in the town of Bocholt in the northwest region of Westphalia. He attended the School of Applied Arts in Münster for a year in 1912, followed by similarly brief attendance at other academies in both Düsseldorf and Munich. In 1915 he enlisted in the German army and fought up to 1917 when he was injured and invalided out. In 1918 he began to create posters for the UNSUNG film company for their chain of Berlin cinemas. Fenneker created more than 40 in a 6-month period, and this prolific burst of creativity came to the attention of Siegbert Goldschmidt, the director of Berlin's Marmor House Cinema. Over the following 6 years, Goldschmidt hired Fenneker to create more posters, and in that period he designed over 140 for Marmor House cinematic screenings. This body of dramatic, largely but not exclusively expressionistic posters was created using traditional lithography, and in addition to the dark textural trademarks of the German expressionist movement, Fenneker also incorporated influences from other sources, including Cubism, Futurism, Art Deco and even Jugendstil for good measure. He was also tasked with the renovation and redesign of 5 other cinemas owned by Goldschmidt, and between 1920 and 1922 he also engaged Fenneker to oversee the entire artistic direction of what at the time was the largest amusement park in Europe. But in 1924, at the depth of Germany's post-war economic misery, the Marmor House went bankrupt, and Fenneker's run of success as a poster artist came to a particularly sudden, if only temporary, end. Not long after, his distinctive illustrations began to proliferate in the pages of several German magazines. He found a regular home with Der Wahr Jakob. This was an unusually left-leaning magazine, but Fenneker made no concessions and ignored politics altogether. He was also working simultaneously for Fliegende Blätter, and similarly he steered clear of the prevailing political ideology of the left or the right, and played instead to his decorative strengths. Ultimately, it was the large body of playfully, occasionally erotic illustrations he produced for the arts magazine Jugend, which came to define his work in this period. And naturally enough, the magazine happily embraced his commitment to imaginative image-making. But once the Nazis took over in 1933, Fenneker seems to have begun working on cinema posters again. His work was now printed with full-colour offset lithography, and although he continues to be one of the period's more expressive and imaginative illustrators, it did appear that the later posters were nothing like as distinctive and visually daring as his early traditional lithographs. The last dated work I found is this poster for a 1943 romantic musical, and Josef Fenneker died of a heart attack in Frankfurt in 1956 at the age of 61. I hope you found this quartet of interest, and there'll be another along just as soon as I can make it. Bye for now.